Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to a very special episode of the show. We've got a long-time acclaimed music and rock author, Mr. Steve Rosen's in the house. He has written a very cool new book on a guy we all know and love. Steve knows him really well, or knew him really well. We all love him. Edward Van Halen, otherwise known as Eddie Van Halen. Tonechaser is the book. Steve Rosen, welcome to Sea of Tranquility. How are you?
Peter, I'm doing great, man. Great. Good morning to you. Very cool to be here, man.
Glad to have you. I think any opportunity we have to talk about Edward Van Halen, the legend, is a good thing. And it's really cool to talk to someone who actually knew him and kind of spent time with him in his life, a life that is cherished and has been documented many times over the years. But we really want to hear your story of your time with the EVH, the great guitarist from Van Halen, one of the most captivating musicians of the modern era. And so Tonechaser is out, and it basically, so before we get into the book itself, maybe you could talk a little bit about your history with rock music and what you've done in your career, other bands you've written on. I know you work with Guitar World magazine for quite a number of years, so maybe give us a little bit of history of yourself first, and then how maybe lead that into the first time you actually spoke to Edward and kind of how that journey went from that first day on.
Yeah, sure, man. I actually began writing for my high school newspaper. I had a little column, and I actually used you remember the logo from Woodstock with the dove sitting atop the guitar neck? I thought, I'm going to be so cool, you know. And because up to that point, you know, if you wrote for a school newspaper, it really had to be school related. You know, you had to write about, you know, the girls' soccer team, blah, blah, blah. But I approached Mrs. Carpenter, my journalism 101 teacher, and said, listen, I'd like to write about music, you know, and I'd like to go out to clubs and maybe see bands and review that. And I think, you know, the students would dig that. And they did. So I actually typed up some letters, and I remember this clearly. In fact, I still have some of those letters on Culver City Centurion. We were the Centurions in Culver City, which is kind of a west side town, sort of around Venice, California, that kind of thing. And I sent out these letters to the Whiskey, to the Troubadour. There was a club down south called in Long Beach, I think, Huntington Beach, sorry, the Golden Bear, which is a pretty famous, you would know these things, Peter. There was actually a club out in Pasadena called the Ice House, which is probably not far from where Edward was living at the time. And so I sent out this letter, and they all responded. They said, yes, just let us know when you want to come out, and, you know, we'll give you some tickets and you can review the show. So I was seeing these amazing shows, you know, back in '71, which is the year I graduated from high school. You know, God, who did I see at the Whiskey? I think like the Beach Boys and maybe the Allman Brothers. I mean, it was just unbelievable, you know. And I'd go out to the Ice House, and I was seeing like Deacon Song do their, you know, stoner routine. I mean, like first time, way before they were famous, you know.
Sure.
Right. And then the Troubadour, I mean, seeing people like Steve Martin, you know, with the arrow through the head and playing banjo, a remarkable musician, you know, and Martin Mull and, oh my God, Poco, and just millions of these artists who would ultimately become pretty big artists, you know, and I love doing that. So following high school, I went to UCLA for a year, and my reasons for going to UCLA was really more of an accommodation to my father, who loved the UCLA Bruins basketball team, than me wanting to pursue higher education at a arguably wonderful school. So I thought, well, if I go there, maybe I can get tickets from my dad and me to go see the Bruins. And I did, you know, as a student, you know, you got tickets to go see the basketball game. But along the way, I did write for the UCLA Daily Bruin, the little school newspaper. And that was pretty cool, man. They had some really excellent writers. And I remember the music editor was a guy called Stan Berkowitz. You know, I just thought it was so great, and I wanted to write about music, but the music thing was filled up. So they said, well, do some live stage, production plays, that kind of thing. And I did that. And that was amazing. And I write about this whole experience in the book. There was an English teacher I had who was horrible. He hated me. He hated my writing. He said, Rosen, you think you're a better writer than you are. You'll never do anything as a journalist. And look, maybe we all run up against those kinds of people in our lives. But I really despise this guy. So I just kind of lost any, inclination I had to kind of see out the year or pursue journalism further. I kind of basically dropped out at the end of the year, got an F in his class, and I thought, well, can I cuss here, Peter?
Yes, for sure.
I said, fuck you, asshole. And I wrote about that. I wish I'd remembered his name. I wouldn't have used his name, of course. But, so I went out and I started, trying to pursue it on a little bigger scope as a music journalist. I got a couple things printed in this little local, it was like a softcore newspaper called the LA Star. And you bought the LA Star because you would turn to the back page and find out the phone numbers and addresses for the massage parlors, right? You weren't picking up the LA Star to glean any deep insights about the, world music scene, But I was able to get a couple live reviews printed, and I remember those specifically T-Rex and West Bruce and Lang, who were playing at the Hollywood Palladium.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Famous venue down on Sunset Boulevard. And I kind of use that as a springboard. So that summer, I believe it was the summer of late 72, I went to England and Europe with my buddy, and we hitchhiked around, for about 3 months, and that was amazing. Doing like the Jack Kerouac on the road thing, thinking, we're going to be these bohemian types, we literally slept in tobacco fields in Italy, and, slept in Hyde Park in England, UK. That was just amazing. And somehow the music editor for the LA Star had this amazing Rolodex of the names of publicists and managers in the UK. How we ever got them, I do not know. But he had, publicist names, management. I had a name on there, Max Clifford. And I called him literally, I'd go to one of the red phone booths, after sleeping in Hyde Park and trying to wash up in the, nearest bathroom, and brushing my teeth. And I'd go, hi, Mr. Clifford, my name is Steve Rosen, and I'm over here, from California, and I'm a music journalist. And I was wondering if there's anything I could do. I don't even know why I was calling them. Of course, I wanted to try to get interviews, but it was like, hey, if I could come by and get a free T-shirt, man, I would have been happy. And he goes, yeah, we got Joe Cocker in the office tomorrow. Would you like to come by and interview him? And I almost gagged. I mean, this is the very first interview I ever did. I thought, I said, yes, that would be amazing. So I go to the office the next day, and it's this amazing office, where all the other music management offices are. And, I had brought my cassette player with me in hopes that something would happen. So he ushers me into a room, and they're sitting, behind the desk is Joe Cocker. I loved Joe Cocker. I mean, I loved the Grease Band, man. I loved all of that English stuff. So I sit down, trying to control my hand and, putting the microphone on the table, and I had nothing prepared. I didn't know I was going to interview Joe Cocker, so I mean, I don't even know what I asked him. I think I started with a question about the cover of With a Little Help from My Friends, which is arguably the greatest cover ever done, certainly of a Beatles tune, I mean, in my mind. Jimmy Page is on there, and B.J. Wilson from Procol Harum is playing drums. And we start talking, and he's just amazing. He's just open, and we keep talking. And, I'm sure I asked him about Woodstock. And here's the part that kills me. So the next day, I was actually set up with another interview with this band called Smith, Perkins, and Smith. They were like session guys who had put a band together, but they were amazing. And I'd gotten the record, and I went into the manager's office to listen to the record. It was like Al Perkins, who was I think like a guitar player, but he appeared on a lot of different records. And anyway, so I go in and and I set up my tape player or my cassette again, and I take my Joe Cocker cassette and I put it in and I record over my Joe Cocker interview. Because I think, well, Steve, really, how many interviews are you going to do in your life? And I mean, there's really no importance to keep that interview. And on top of that, it was $1.50 to go buy another cassette. And maybe English cassettes were different than American cassettes. I mean, I don't know these things. I would like to say that's the last time I did that. A couple days later, I actually interviewed Gentle Giant, and I recorded over that. A couple days later, Tony Brainsby. Tony was working with a brand new band called Queen. And he said, hey, man, and he took me under his wing. He actually allowed me and my buddy Chris to sleep in his office overnight. They had like a little shower there, and he said, just be gone, in the morning by the time we, open the doors. I go, absolutely. This guy was remarkable. He was handling this band called Queen. He said, hey, I got all 4 members coming in tomorrow. Would you like to interview them? And I'm thinking, Queen, no, that sounds a little too glam for my taste. I'll pass, Tony. And
epic fail, right? Yep.
Oh my God, that one. Because literally, it was a test. It was a test pressing of the first record. I mean, nobody knew who they were. I mean, people probably knew about the band, right? But no one. If they had done interviews, they had done no more than a handful. It could have been one of the very first interviews. So I cringe about that mistake.
It's funny how we both have a Gentle Giant story, because I actually had a mishap as well with Gentle Giant in an interview. So I went to go in. I've told this story on the channel before, but I went to go interview Derek Shulman, the lead singer, about 20 years ago in his office, DRT Studios in New York City. And we had a great sit down and interview. I had the digital recorder and whatnot. And we had this great conversation that was well over an hour. And then I get home and I go to listen to it, and there was some kind of glitch with the recording, so you could barely hear him or I on it, and there's all this static going on. I'm like, oh my God. So I literally had to listen to that tape probably 10 times to decipher as much as I could out of it. And I was like, I thought I was going to lose the whole thing. I'm like, I could barely hear what we're saying. And I'm like, but thankfully I remembered a lot of what he talked about. And I made it work, and the interview was great. But I was just like, oh man, this is a disaster, because I'm a huge fan of the band, and just going to meet him. And I've since spoken to Derek many, many times, and he's just a wonderful person. But yeah, that's funny how we both have a Gentle Giant story.
Yeah, that's unbelievable, man. And I wish I could say that was the last time. I didn't record over cassette subsequently. However, I was using literally, man, this garbage $5 cassette player. I mean, it was horrible. And, literally like a $2 Radio Shack microphone. So at any given moment, the cap stands on the cassette player would start whining and groaning, and then that gets picked up through the microphone, And in fact, in the book, Edward says a couple of times, "Hey man, it sounds like your tape player is dying," which got embarrassed the hell out of me, because it's like, oh my God, he could hear this happening, for him to comment on it. So yeah, that was horrible. Tony Brainsby, I've got Paul McCartney playing in Birmingham tomorrow with Wings. You want to go interview Paul McCartney? I go, oh my God. So, so my buddy and I take the train up to Birmingham from London, just like 100 miles. I see McCartney with Wings, and that's amazing. Go backstage, and there was a bunch of other writers. It was more a press conference. And, I think I eked out one question, being terrified, what do you ask Paul McCartney? Well, when are the Beatles going to get back together, right? And he said something nice, and didn't usher me out the door. So in a long response to your question, so I came back to the U.S. and using these stories that had been printed in the L.A. Star, I got a little story printed in the L.A. Free Press, which is a pretty hip underground newspaper at the time. Had a live review printed there. I had the doors opened for me by Lydia Woltad. Lydia was a publicist at Gibson and Strongberg, who were literally one of the first rock and roll PR companies. So they handled Beck, a band called Black Kangaroo, Steely Dan, the Stones, Dr. Hook, and they opened their doors to me, man. And they made all their bands available to me. And she literally called Guitar Player magazine and said, "Hi, I've got a writer here, Steve Rosen, and he's going to be interviewing Jeff Beck. Could you use the story?" And Jim Crockett just said, "Yes, if we like the story, we'll use it." I interviewed Jeff, and the interview was great. And I sent it into Jim Crockett, a guitar player, and he loved the story and put it on the cover. So my first story for a guitar player was a cover, which subsequently write for them until this is like December 73, would write for them until December 78. That ended. By then I was writing for Cream and Circus. I was writing for some Japanese magazines, Player magazine, some European magazines, UK magazines. Would start writing for Guitar World in '84. Wrote for them for about 4 years, where I wrote those 3, pretty significant Van Halen cover stories. Was writing books along the way. Wrote a book on Jeff Beck. Wrote a book on Black Sabbath, Free and Bad Company. Later would write books on Prince and Springsteen, who I never interviewed, but I was approached to write those books, and I put together books. From research I found, I interviewed, guitar players who had played with them, engineers, that kind of thing. Did a book on Randy Rhoads, and then kind of fast forward to 2020, write a book on my friendship with Edward Van Halen. So that's kind of the nutshell version of 50 years of writing.
So where was Edward at in his career? Or like, can you go back to that first time you actually spoke to him? Like what was going on in the world of Van Halen at the time?
Right, sure. So Van Halen had graduated from sort of the backyard party thing out in Pasadena, putting on their own shows, Pasadena Civic, Pasadena City College, to playing Gazzarri's, Starwood, and then ultimately the whiskey, as we all know. When I met Edward in June of 1977, they had signed their deal with Warner Brothers, but that first record was still, 7 or 8 months away, would be released in February 78. They had been playing the whiskey, so they had graduated to the whiskey. And around Hollywood, they were a household name. Everybody was talking about Van Halen and this guitar player, Eddie Van Halen. The strange thing is, I had never seen Van Halen play. I'd never heard Edward play before first talking to him in June 77, which was odd because I was at the Whiskey and the Starwood during that period a lot. I was there, many times a week, but somehow I missed seeing them. And that first time I met him was just amazing. I was introduced to him by Michelle Meyer. Michelle booked the whiskey. She also booked a couple other punk clubs, Madame Wong's East and Madame Wong's West. Madame Wong's East was a pretty hip punk club, like in downtown LA. It was you really didn't want to go there after night. It was in a pretty seedy part of town, but it was what punk was about. And she booked my band. I had a band called Deluge, and she booked us into both clubs, never hearing us, So I owed her. I love Michelle. She was amazing. She introduced me to Edward, and we had this conversation upstairs at the Whiskey in one of the dressing rooms, and it was just amazing. We somehow, I don't know if he brought it up or I brought it up, but we started talking about Clapton. And I realized, wow, this guy loved Clapton. I loved Clapton, Cream specifically, but I knew a lot about him. I knew, his work earlier, obviously the Yardbirds and, the Roosters and that blues stuff he was doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, we talked about Eric, we talked about Jeff Beck, Ritchie Blackmore, and it was just a remarkable conversation, very comfortable man. And I really liked the guy. I did ask him about, the deal on Warner's. Everybody had heard about that, and he was just so self-effacing. He goes, "Yeah, man, were recording the first record. I don't even know if the first record had been done by June '77. I mean, it may have been, they may have started recording by then. He says, you know, man, yeah, you know, I just, you know, I think we made a good record and I hope it does well. I mean, you know, my God, if I was in a band and my band had scored a fucking deal on Warner Brothers Records, I'd say, dude, man, we're on Warner Brothers, no record's coming out. I mean, you know, but he was not like that at all. He was the opposite of that, man. I mean, he downplayed that. If I, you know, said, Ed, what a great fucking solo, he'd go, yeah. He'd almost be not angry, but upset. You know, it's like, one, he never needed to hear that. You know, he knew he was a very, very good guitar player. But it wasn't in an outwardly egocentric kind of way. He just knew he was good and he didn't need to hear that, you know. And it's almost as if when someone would comment on his work, it was almost as if it was demeaning it, because I think in some respects he thought his work, not in any highfalutin way, but was sort of, it didn't need to be commented on. I mean, you know, Da Vinci didn't need to hear he was a brilliant artist. And, you know, John Steinbeck didn't need to hear that he had written an amazing book with, you know, East of Eden. It was, you know what I mean? I think those people were above that, you know, and I think Edward was too.
Yeah, there's a humbleness. The impression I've always gotten, never speaking to him, of course, is that he was a very humble guy. Yeah. So I'm really curious, since we're talking about the early days and, you know, them coming up, getting the Warner Brothers deal. So did he ever speak to you about the tour opening for Black Sabbath, which I'm sure was a big deal for them, opening for, obviously, a band I'm sure they admired, but Sabbath is on the downswing, Van Halen's on the upswing. And by all accounts of almost everybody who I've ever spoken to who saw one of those shows, Van Halen blew Black Sabbath off the stage every night. Did he ever talk about that at all? Were they aware, or was he specifically aware of just how successful they were becoming on that tour, on stage, opening for one of the biggest bands of the 70s?
I mean, Peter, he did touch on that. You know, because certainly I would ask him, hey man, what was it like being on that first tour? And let me backpedal a little bit. I can tell you that those first two tours, the first two records, are when he was happiest. I mean, he was full of joy. Everything was new for him. I mean, he was going from the whiskey, you know, playing in front of 200 people, to opening, you know, on these, you know, auditorium days, you know, and playing with Journey and Montrose. And certainly he was a Montrose fan, obviously. Yes. You know, playing with Sabbath. So he was really, really jubilant during those days. He did talk about, at a point in time, that their first record was doing better than whatever Journey record was out at the time. I think they had about 4 or 5 records, and I don't know my chronology well enough to know what record would have been out.
Either Infinity or Evolution, I would think, right about that time.
Right, which are obviously great records.
Yeah.
And I see your T-shirt here. You know, huge records, but they were, you know, they were outselling Journey at the time, rising up the Billboard charts, and Journey was aware of that and making life really miserable for Van Halen, giving them like literally 15-minute sound checks, not allowing them to use any of their pyro. I think Edward was using this big hollowed out bombshell. He used to put like his Echoplex in there, you know, and I don't think they allowed him to use the bombshell, and really giving them short script for everything, you know. And that didn't make him too happy. He never really commented about playing with Sabbath. I mean, I knew he was a Sabbath fan, or blowing them off. I don't think Edward looked at things that way. Certainly Ozzy was aware of it. You know, he would leave Black Sabbath shortly after and go, you know, recruit Randy Rhoads. But yeah, he was aware of the gaining momentum of the band. And that's when they step out to do the Day on the Green in July '78. The Day on the Green were the shows put on by promoter Bill Graham, where he'd bring together various bands. So on that day, AC/DC opened. I think that might have been AC/DC's first tour of the U.S. Nobody really knew who they were. Van Halen was second, Pat Travers, Aerosmith, and Foreigner. So I did ask him about that show, you know, and in fact, I would run into him for the second time at that show. And on the cover of the book, on the back cover, there's pictures, and that's from the Day on the Green show, famously taken by Niels Lozauer, the amazing Van Halen's official photographer. And when I'm there at the show talking with Edward, it's as if it's just another day at work, man. He doesn't seem to be nervous at all, you know, playing, you know, this show with all these, you know, monster bands. But later I would talk to him. He goes, yeah, man, I was nervous. You know, those are big bands, you know. And I asked him a stupid question, you know. And I asked him a lot of stupid questions. And I have these sections in the book called Note, where it's me sort of disengaging from the book, and I am really talking to directly to you, the reader. So it's Steve Rosen talking about Steve Rosen, and I'm going, reader, that idiot Steve Rosen just asked a stupid question, and I'm referring to, I asked Edward, I said, do you think you were playing good back during those days? I mean, there was no greater guitar player, you know, and it was really meant never in a derogatory sense, but I kind of wanted him to say, yeah, man, I was really coming into my own and finding, you know, the best solos that worked, and my tone was getting, you know, more, refined. Edward never thought like that. So a lot of times when I would ask questions in hopes of eliciting that kind of response, they just came out as dumb, almost insulting questions. But yeah, I think he was aware that they were moving up the ladder. And shortly after that, yeah, man, they would go out on their own and start headlining. So
real quick, I mean, we're talking about like meteoric rise, and
it was unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, could you tell, because we've heard so many stories over the years from so many rock stars who didn't really know how to handle the fame, and that quick rise to superstardom is just, it's not always what it all cracked up to be. And obviously, you know, we've heard lots of stories about Edward and his demons over the years and things, but like, could you tell like fairly early on how well or not was he accepting all the fame that was quickly getting thrown upon him in the band?
I always felt that he was really uncomfortable with it. As you say, the demons were there from the first time I spent any real time with him. You know, Ed was drinking and doing drugs. Yeah, literally from those first times I met him, you know, 78, he would come over to the pad and he was drinking. Hey man, you got anything to drink? You know, and I also write now, you know, to be completely honest here, I never drank, only because, well, several reasons. I hated the taste of alcohol, and I tended to get migraine headaches, and alcohol, a beer could trigger them, and they were, if anyone has never experienced a migraine headache, consider yourselves blessed, because it's one of the most excruciating, painful things you can imagine. So I never really drank for that reason, not from any moral or health standpoint, you know. But I did drugs with Ed. I mean, I'll be honest with you, man. You know, if he had coke, I would do it with him. You know, so we were getting high. I think the difference is that when Edward went home, I think he continued doing drugs, and I never did them, you know, out of context. Which isn't to say I didn't buy cocaine once in a while. I did, but I just never. I never thought in any fashion was I addicted to it in any way. So Edward, so those things were there with Edward early on. I don't think, it's not like he ever said, my God, you know, we're going out on the road again and I'm going to be away from home, or, oh man, I have all these interviews to do. Though he told me many times he never liked doing interviews. Though honestly, with me at least, he was really, really good. I mean, he really understood, you know, the give and take. he never really went out a lot. I don't think he liked that either. I saw the pressure mounting on him within the band, and I write about those moments and things that he said. I mean, by the second record, you know, there were fractions between he and Dave and Michael. And, you know, he talked about those. And then, you know, again, I write in the book where he say, don't print this, don't use that, you know. And I never used any of that at the time. So you have to understand. So he's telling me during the second record, you know, Mike's tone, or, you know, I'm unhappy with Mike, or Dave is off on a mountain climb or something, you know. To have printed that stuff back in the time at that moment, that would have been devastating. I mean, Warner's would have gone insane. I mean, you know, so I never used any of that. So I just want to put this little caveat in here. So fast forward, you know, some of those interviews are like 40 years old. I did put in the book, I included his comment of don't print this. I wanted people to understand that these were personal and poignant moments as they existed back in 1979. But in 2020, when I was writing the book, yes, they're still personal, but they're a little bit more common knowledge, and they had to go in there because I wanted the book to be as honest as possible.
But yeah, and it also shows that everything wasn't all pink and rosy early on, even, right? Even though it seemed like the band was on top of the world, everything had to have been great, but maybe behind the scenes, not as great as everybody thinks it is, right? But that's with every band, though, right? No bands are perfect at all.
No, absolutely. I mean, you think about, you know, those famous, you know, feuds between, you know, Daltrey and Townsend and Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, you know, I mean, Steven Tyler and Joe Perry, and there's always drugs and alcohol involved too.
Yeah.
You know, and why that happens, I don't know, man. That's beyond my pay scale. But yes, there were problems early on. I think culminating in Edward building 5150. He says, hey, you know, I'm going to record 24 hours a day. I'm going to do exactly what I want. You know, freaked out Ted Templeman. Ted, who was obviously a key member of that inner circle, you know, felt maybe, you know, and Edward is telling me this story. Ted felt a little, you know, once removed now, because now he's not in there in the studio all the time with Edward. And, you know, what is Don Landy, Edward's engineer, and Edward up to when I'm not there? Dave felt threatened because, you know, a lot of that control was taken away from him because Ted wasn't there. Ted was always Dave's guy. So yeah, man, the greatest guitar player in the world, one of the most successful bands in the world. Nothing ever looks like it appears from the outside.
So I'm real curious, hearing from you just how humble he was and maybe not as comfortable with his success as everybody might have thought. So during the 80s especially, there was a lot of competition among all the hotshot guitar players. And there were, you know, I remember, you know, being a late teens, early 20s kid, and, you know, we all had our favorite guitar players. And it's like, well, who's better, you know? And then, you know, Edward for a number of years was the guy. And then all of a sudden, you know, Randy Rhoads comes along. And then a couple of years later, you know, Yngwie Malmsteen comes along, and you got George Lynch and Dave Meniketti and all these other guys, and everybody's vying for the top spot. Did Edward give a shit about all this at all? Did he ever talk about some of his peers, and did he have any opinions on them? Was he threatened by any of them at all? Did any of that ever come up in conversations?
I mean, that's an excellent question, and a big answer is no. He never looked at Alan Holdsworth. He loved,
yes,
you know, and I think he looked at Alan as something rare, something different. But it's never like he said, God, can you believe what Alan did on the first record? You know, I wish I could play like that. Or my God, did you hear Alan's solo? Or God, how does he do that? I wish I could. It never came out like that. Actually, very quickly, there's several Alan Holdsworth stories, but one of them Edward is over at my house. Edward used to come by my little guest house on Weepaw Way, and sometimes he'd come over because we were doing an interview. Sometimes he'd come over unannounced, and he just wanted to hang out. And I loved when he would do that, you know. And so he'd come in the house, and I had a couple of guitars. I was a guitar player, not a very good one, but I played. And you know, he'd pick up a Strat or a Les Paul that I had, and he'd just start noodling. He'd just start playing, you know. And watching him play an electric guitar acoustically, and being 2 feet away from him, and watching his fingers on the neck, man, and really being able to see his picking. I mean, that was, again, I hate to use these analogies, man. It's like as if you were watching Picasso and you were standing over his shoulder and you were watching Picasso with the paint strokes. He's an amazing artist, but now you're seeing the paint stroke and how each stroke and the pressure and the amount of paint, you know. Or John Steinbeck is my favorite writer. Or if you could have been sitting there watching John Steinbeck writing Of Mice and Men, and he's typing it out and he's thinking, no, that's not the way. You realize how brilliant these people are. So I'm watching this, you know, and I'm saying, my God, he's just so beyond description, you know, when you're sitting that close to him, right? So we're talking, and I think he had brought up, I think he had asked, have you ever interviewed Alan Holdsworth? And I said, yeah, I did. I did. You know, he's amazing. And Edward said, yeah, he does. And I can't remember his exact words. They are in the book. Yeah, he does all of those legato phrases, and you know, you can't hear his pick. It's this seamless, sinewy, snake-like thing, and it's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
I go, yeah, man, it's amazing. And then Edward says, yeah, man, you know, he says, I've been sitting down a lot, and I can't really do that. And he was trying to do some of these amazing phrases, and they were incredible to my ears. But it's just, it's as if he was like defending himself, like, well, I can sort of play like that when I'm playing live. And he brings up an amazing point. When you stand up and you're playing, right, your whole posture is different than sitting down. And that's why guys who practice sitting down and then stand up, they can't play. Edward always practiced standing up. You know, he said, yeah, man, when I'm playing live and I'm on tour and I'm standing up, I can play that stuff. He says, but I'm kind of rusty now. So I think that was Edward's way of kind of saying, yes, Alan Holdsworth was on a planet unto himself. But no, man, he never looked at any of those other guys and said, God, what an amazing solo they did. Or conversely, my God, man, my solo just blows, you know, anything Warren DeMartini could play away. I asked him once about Randy Rhoads, and I wish I had pursued that line of conversation more. And he goes, yeah, Randy's a good guitar player, you know. Randy is one of the few guys who admits that he copied me. Now, I know that there are, you know, conflicting stories about Edward and the way he sometimes treated Randy, not so politely. I don't know if those are true. I never asked Edward about them. I do believe he thought Randy was a good guitar player, but that's about all I know. I know that he really wasn't that aware of Yngwie, though at one point we had a conversation about Yngwie and Dave, about how Dave deserved Yngwie. Yngwie was an amazing guitar player, but Yngwie could be a handful, man. Yngwie had a very inflated ego. And I could tell you a story about Yngwie and me, and sort of getting into a little fist fight and all kinds of things. And me, it was unbelievable. He's throwing a drink in his face and thinking he's the biggest asshole who's ever lived. He was in Alcatraz, who was my friend Jimmy Waldo's band. Jimmy played keyboards, you know. He said, hey, man, you got to check out this guitar player, Yngwie Malmsteen. I go out to Yngwie's house out in the valley, about 20 minutes from my house. Yngwie's an asshole. I said, well, what about Jeff Beck? Because Jeff Beck was my yardstick. You know, if you didn't give the right answer about Jeff Beck, you know, I was going to dismiss you. And he goes, who? And I go, Jeff Beck. And he goes, man, I never heard of Jeff Beck. I go, Yngwie, let me get this correct. You have never heard of Jeff Beck. He goes, no, man, I never heard of him. Fast forward to the story that appears in Guitar World magazine. titled the God with the Chip on His Shoulder, and in big bold black print is that quote, Jeff Beck, I never heard of him. I run into Yngwie a couple months later at a Ronnie Dio after hours. Yngwie comes over to me and says, "You're a fucking asshole, man." I go, he goes, "You're a fucking lousy writer. I fucking hate you." I go, "I don't care." He goes, "There's a fucking lies in your story." I go, "Yngwie, every single word you said to me is on tape. You want to hear the tape?" It didn't really matter to me what he was saying. It just didn't matter because I thought he was such an asshole. And then he makes an anti-Semitic slur. And I let that go. And he lets go with another one. And that was it. I take my drink. It's like I'm in a Western, man. And I toss it in his face and he's like temporarily blinded. I kind of half slap, half punch him, and he kind of goes down and we're grappling on the floor. And I am now ready to kill him. I mean, I really wanted to hurt the guy. The bouncers come over and pull us apart, and he gets carried out, like the firemen carry. One guy's got the legs, and he's literally physically thrown out of the party. And I know I'm digressing just a little bit. Let me finish this. 1995, Player magazine, a Japanese magazine, wants me to go to Florida to interview Yngwie. My first response is, there's not enough money in the world. And I thought, you know what? He sees my name on a list of people coming to interview him. He could have shut it down. He could have said, "I'm not going to talk to that Rosen guy." I thought, you know what? Okay, I'm going to go. I went with my friend Niels Lozauer, who took photos. The moment I opened the door to his house, man, he hugged me, apologized. "Man, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have said that. I apologize. I was drunk. I was young. I apologize." And hey, right is right, man. We became not friends, but I interviewed him several more times over the years. He was a wonderful host, showed me his guitar collection, his Ferraris. So getting back to your question.
Things happen when you're younger. I mean, it's
they did, and I knew he was just trying to hurt me. I really didn't think that he was an anti-Semite, but he thought, well, I can't piss this guy off by saying he's a lousy writer, so what else can I do? Hey, I got it, But yeah, Edward never really responded like that. And in fact, he rarely brought up other guitar players.
I always got the impression that everyone else was more worried about that. And because I don't remember ever reading any interview with him where he mentioned anybody else on the scene. But yet you read all these other interviews with all the other hotshot guys, and that was always coming up. So I think he was just kind of like, hey, I was kind of the trendsetter. I don't need to get involved in these conversations. If they want to have it out, let them do it. I can't be bothered. That's the impression I always got.
Yeah, man, that's true. And extrapolating that one step further, he was a little annoyed that he was aware of everybody copying him. So that's what he heard. So I think for that reason alone, he wasn't listening to a lot of these guys. So yeah, again, it goes back to him kind of knowing who he was and being pretty secure in his own skin kind of thing.
How much time, so I guess if we fast forward a bit, how much time did you spend with him, like in the later years where, Van Halen's really not much of a force anymore, and there's long bouts of inactivity, and, he's got the health issues, the marriage problems with Valerie. Did you spend a lot of time with him in the later years?
Honestly, Peter, no. And I don't want to give the book away to anybody who maybe hasn't read it, but I write about that at length. I recognized Edward changing, honestly, early 90s, and I could never understand really what was going on in his head. It's as if he became a different person. And I write about a couple scenarios where I interviewed him a couple times in the 90s, and these interviews are set up through Warner Brothers. Typically, I'd call Ed. Ed, Guitar World needs an interview, man. Can we set something up? Yeah, call me next week. Come by. I'll come by. Edward, Player magazine. He was God in Japan. I mean, he was huge. Well, Van Halen were huge in Japan. So Japan would want a story, or European magazine. And he, I always just called him. I never went through management or a label. And so it got to a point where and this is it's an amazing part of the story. It's very sad. I don't want to give that away, but I saw him again for the first time in a while at an interview that Warner Brothers set up. So I was no longer calling him to set up an interview. It was held at 5150. I walk in and he doesn't even know who I am.
Wow.
Yeah, and it was horrible. I mean, he acted as if he had never met me before. So yeah, that was pretty terrible. So in answer to your question, I spent far less time with him in those waning years than I ever did probably the first dozen years.
Wow.
Yeah, you know,
that must have been hurtful to you, seeing as how much time you spent with him for all those years, and to him not even remember who you were. I mean, that's got to be kind of shocking.
It was horrible, you know, and I hate to use this analogy because it's so cruel, but it's so accurate. It's as if he had dementia, and he did not have dementia, but as if you know, he just literally didn't know who I was. And then there would be moments when he would act like he knew who I was, but even those moments were cold and distant. I would later learn that he was sick. You know, by 2003, when the relationship ended, you know, the whole world was aware that, you know, he had been battling cancer. I believe, and I don't know this for a fact at all, and I don't write about it in the book because it's only supposition. I believe that he was aware of being sick even much earlier than he even let on. Again, I could be wrong, but I'm trying to think, you know, what was causing this change in him. You rightly mentioned, Peter, the band was in splinters. The label, you know, at a point in time, he's no longer on Warner Brothers. Valerie, the marriage was breaking up. And while we're here, I just wanted to mention one thing. There are some moments in the book that are incredibly personal things he said to me. I really had to struggle for a long time whether I could include those elements, and I ultimately did. And the last thing I ever wanted to do, and not one single reader has ever come to me and said, "My God, why would you print that shit about him, man? That's so personal. That's horrible." Not one person has ever said that. And in fact, the other readers have come back and said, "My God, thank you for being so honest. I now know so much more about him." And these are very personal things he said to me about his marriage, you know, some comments about Wolf, which were all positive. And I included those because honestly, in a way, they revealed so much about who he was and what he was going through at the time. But again, the last thing I ever wanted to do was to hurt him, embarrass him, hurt his family, you know, insult any fan. You know, that was the last thing I did. I could have easily have left those moments out. I could have left a ton of that stuff out, you know, and written that book. I just couldn't deal with myself. I couldn't have been honest with the reader or Edward. So I did want to say that. But yes, man, he changed a lot. In my mind, in my eyes, at least for me, he became way less caring about me. You know, maybe that's a selfish thing to say. Maybe with his other friends and family, he was this other person, but he changed for sure. And I think all of those pieces came into play. Look, man, him finding out he was sick like that, my God, that's just, you know, that's reason enough for him to treat me like that. I suppose on one level, okay, hey, he can be friends or not be friends with anybody he wants. And excuse me, and I don't want to give it away, but the way it ended was really hurtful. So that I could never understand. And if you read the book, you'll understand those bits.
Despite all that, I'm sure you still consider him a friend, though.
Oh my God, I love the guy. it's a really great point. Because I'll be honest, Peter, after the excuse me, I'm sorry. After the relationship ended in 2003, I was hurt, and I didn't want to hear about Van Halen, what they were doing, what they weren't doing. They came out with the years later the different kind of truth record. They're now back together with Dave, which I could not understand for the life of me. But it really goes back to Edward. Edward would sometimes take the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
And for him, it was all about the music, and he was able to put those relationships aside. So, hey, that wasn't my decision. But yeah, for a lot of years, I was, I couldn't hear about Van Halen. But, eventually, yes, I thought about the book. I was originally going to write Edward's authorized biography in 1985. I write about this in the book. We signed these simple little contracts, and there's photos of those contracts in the book. So that book obviously never happened. So these years go by, and I start thinking back to that book that never was, and I start thinking more about it. 2017, 2018, I had some buddies who say, "Hey man, you should write the book. Write that book." And I go, "Man, I don't know. I honestly didn't know if I was up to it. If I was up to it emotionally, and I'm not saying I was still distraught over what happened, but there were those feelings that were still there. I didn't know if I was capable as a writer. I wanted to write the most brilliant book I could, because he was the most brilliant guitar player, arguably, who ever lived. And I wanted the words to match and elicit from the reader, the emotions you felt when you heard an Eddie Van Halen solo. I didn't know if I was that good a writer. Anyway, I put those all aside. On August 24th, my birthday, 2020, I write the book. But yes, in answer to your question, I'm sorry, Peter, I always felt like I was his friend. And even during all those years, I still felt a connection with him. I reached out to him a couple times, sent him emails, and that was hard to do. Never heard back. I actually had his phone number that someone had given to me, and I called him, and I hear the voice, "Come on, hi, this is Eddie." And literally, man, I froze, because I hadn't spoken to him for many years, and it was his message. So I leave a message, "Hi, Edward, this is Steve. Man, I hope you've been well all these years. I miss you. I love you. Call me." I never heard from him. But yes, man, I always felt like his friend, and those amazing times far overrode any of the negativity.
Well, that's
I love the guy, man. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's the important thing. So in closing, everyone, I hope we have piqued your interest and whet your appetite for reading Tonechaser. I want to read the full title of the book. So it's Tonechaser-Understanding Edward, My 26-Year Journey with Edward Van Halen. So I'll put a link to order the book. I've got the website. I'm looking at it right now down in the comments below, so you can go get yourself a copy. I'm assuming this is available on Amazon and all those other places where you can get books, right? Amazon, Reverb, eBay, and Etsy. There you go. So get your copy. Steve, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. These were fascinating personal stories about a guy everybody loves. So thank you for doing this book, and thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate you coming here. Thank you very much, Peter. A lot of fun. Thank you, man. Thanks, Steve. And everybody watching, visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube all together all the damn time. We'll see you real soon here. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. For Steve Rosen, I am Pete Pardo. Thanks, everybody. Go check out Tonechaser. Bye-bye. See ya.